Hello, YouTube. Hello, Brian.
Hey,
How you doing?
I am great.
Love to hear it. Love to hear it. Thanks everyone for being here today, either live or if you watch the replay, for watching the replay. So let's go ahead and just kick this thing off. Hello and welcome to Python Bytes, where we deliver Python news and headlines directly to your earbuds. This is what episode? Episode 470. I know what we're doing. And it is Monday, February 23rd, 2026. I'm Michael Kennedy.
And I'm Brian Ocken.
This episode is brought to you by us. We have many interesting things available or in the works that we're going to be announcing. I know, Brian, you're working on your Lean TDD book. I just released Command Book, which ironically is not actually a book, but other things. And then obviously our courses and so on. So seriously, we put this stuff out here because we think it's a perfect complement to the podcast, and we'd really love if you'd consider it as part of your learning, reading, and so on. Also, consider signing up to the newsletter. We got a bunch of people enjoying the newsletter. We put a lot of effort into it to generate extra info, background info, more links, not just, hey, we're emailing our show notes out. Isn't that inventive? No, we're doing extra, and Brian is spearheading that, so thank you for doing that, Brian. And yeah, connect with us on the social, subscribe on here on YouTube. If you're interested in catching the live show, just go pythonbytes.fm/live, click the link, crush the bell, so that way you actually get a pop-up when we're streaming live like we are right now. And with that, I think I want to talk about inline snapshots. What do you think, Brian?
Yeah, sure. Let's zoom in, I don't know. Sure.
Zoom somehow.
somehow. So I'm going to cover, and this is a fun article, actually, from the Pydantic blog from Alex Hall, and the article is "Better Python Tests with Inline Snapshot." And actually, it's that, but it's also kind of a peek at how Pydantic is doing some of their testing. And it's not a bad idea to try to emulate Pydantic because they've been doing great. So anyway, let's dive into what they're talking about here. The problem is the maintaining test data for complex data structures and how you compare. So their example is like create a user with an ID of 23 or 120. Anyway, test a name and an ID, and then checking to make sure that it's really is, getting the data, the object, and validating that it's correct, that some action happened. This is all cool and all, but it's not really. It's hard to fill that in, and if you have tests like that all over the place, it's hard to make sure that they're up to date and everything. So there's a lot of ways that people have done attacked this problem before. Like they give a shout out to Syrupy, which is a cool project also. One of the issues. Okay, so one of the issues is, let's say you've got a bunch of stuff these systems working right now. This is kind of how the workflow is. It's working, or because of other testing or manual testing or whatever, and you want to like just save a bunch of have some tests and save what the output is, and then test against that, like known input, and it's working. So grab the output and compare the two. And that's the sort of the model. And with Syrupy, it saves that in an external file, but with inline snapshot, it saves it right in your test. So I'm going to take a look. You start out with like an empty snapshot with an empty bracket, and then you run the test with inline snapshot equals fix. So it's like fixing the snapshot or fixing them in place. And then it actually goes out and changes your test and fills in that little template bracket with data that you can compare with whatever you want. And that's actually pretty awesome. It just like turns the user like some data structure into a dictionary or whatever. Take a data structure, snapshot that, and then you can run with it. There's a few reasons why I kind of really love this. One of the things is just maintenance. If you're like before and after a big change, refactoring, you can like set some of these up and then like refactor and then go back and make sure you didn't intend to change anything. You want to make sure things change. And then sometimes you do want to change like lots of the data structure. And then you can, like, having this right in line with your tests, you can have that like go through a code review and manually inspect the test and say, yes, this is actually what I want it to look like. The danger is if you don't manually inspect, then you're not going to you're just believing whatever's there. Then your tests just become a change detector test and nothing else. And there's, sometimes there's a place for that. So anyway, great article about snapshot testing. But I also do want to shout out to a lot of the other tools that they bring up in this article. So I'm going to go through some of them. There's the PyTest examples, which is the plugin that they're talking about with this inline examples. There is inline. Wait, no, this is another tool. So PyTest examples is another tool that they've got, and that's pretty cool. The inline snapshot is this tool that we're talking about. And then there's Syrupy, which isn't a bad tool, and if that's better for your workflow, take a look at that as well, and that's very popular. And then there's a dirty equals, which is a fun, I should probably cover this at some other point if I haven't already. A fun almost equal sort of a thing. So you can do things like, is the number positive? And there's a whole bunch of other extra things around comparisons that are not exact comparisons that are kind of fun. And then a shout out to a thing called executing, which is being able to, it says a mini package that lets you get information about what the frame is currently doing. So about their current execution frame in Python, which is, I've never had a need for that, but it's kind of interesting. So anyway, shout out to that. Great article. Lots of tools.
That might be interesting for like low effort logging and stuff, enhancing test output or just logging in general. Is like, I got an error. I want to just say, well, what parameters were supplied to this function and who called it? Maybe something like that. Just and automatically add that to the test output or something like that.
Yeah, there might be some cool, fun things for logging the execution frame. Yeah.
Nice. That's a bunch of cool tools. I love the idea too. I like this. Now, let's jump over here. I want to shock you, Brian, with this, but I want to talk about Jolt. Okay. So Jolt is a TUI, a pretty sweet TUI actually, which is battery intelligence for your laptop. Okay, so this is not really a Python tool, but it's certainly a tool that Python people could love, right? It's kind of a developer-oriented thing, right? So It says battery intelligence for your laptop, real-time power monitoring, process, energy tracking, battery health insights, all in your terminal, and it works on Mac OS and Linux. Sorry, Windows folks, you may be able to do this in Windows Subsystem for Linux, though I wouldn't bet on it. I'm not sure. So it's easy, just brew, install it, or whatever, however you like. And they've got kind of a picture here, but honestly, the picture is not as inspiring as maybe the reality. So before I tell you more, let me switch over to my laptop, which actually has it running here. And notice it's got a huge green bar, which is how much battery I got left. But it also tells you I'm on battery. It's been on battery for 3 hours and 27 minutes, and it has 3 hours and 40 minutes left. Yes, it's a MacBook Air. It should last longer, but it's doing a lot of stuff, as you'll see. It gives you stuff about the health, like how many times has it been charged? 176. What is the temperature? What is its current energy draw, or how much energy is actually contained in it, and its health. It shows you power of your machine. So right now, my laptop is using 8.8 watts of power. The CPU is 1.5. The GPU is like basically nothing. I bet you it's mostly screen, if I had to guess. And then it gives you all your processes. So you can see the Vivaldi is the most significant impact here at like 57% CPU because I have it screen sharing back. That's why we can look at it, right? But it's got Claude, it's got Firefox, Port Killer, which I talked about. I had Port Killer open last night to do a Cloudflare tunnel for a project and just didn't shut it down. And it's like parsing the state of the system a lot to get its things, which is cool. And it's got this like moving graph at the bottom of your energy consumption, temperature. You can like toggle through these things. How do I can like toggle to like battery percentage over time, watt over time. There's like all these things you can do. What do you think?
I think this is great. I'm gonna go install this on my laptop right away.
Yeah, it's just brew install Jolt-ish. Let me actually read it so it doesn't give you something terrible if you were to actually do that. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It is. You got to do you got to tap whatever it is you tap. You got to do brew install Jordan D/tap/Jolt, not just straight Jolt. Anyway, I think it's pretty neat. So, yeah, there it is.
And apparently it can work in Windows. We've got somebody said just
Pat.
installed. Yeah.
Pat Decker just installed it under WSL in Windows, and it does work. Pat, thank you for the real-time follow-up. That's fantastic.
And to get it installed, used curl install. And
Sure.
So,
yeah, I probably would have done that on Linux as well.
yeah. So this looks great.
It's really neat. Just as like a what is my system doing, even though it's kind of centered around battery, it's pretty cool actually.
Yeah, and like with laptops, that's mostly what you care about is like how's this impacting my battery.
Yeah, exactly.
So
Anyway, people can check that out. I thought it's a little bit of just a tool rather than a library, but I thought it was fun.
well, nice.
It's not rough. It wasn't that rough anyway.
It's not that rough. Yeah. So let's talk about Ruff. Nice transition there. We of course have talked about Ruff several times and lots of other things around it, but we're going to talk about it a little bit more because Matthias, and sorry Matthias, I'm not going to try to pronounce your last name. A listener sent us in said, hey, you should check this out because now you can format, because if you do rough check for it's linting, but it does a lot of formatting as well, or it can, but you can also do rough format. And so both of those things you can now point those at, I think it's for both of them, can point it at markdown files. So
yes.
And
Let's
so
go.
it's not just documentation because I'm like, we're writing books and stuff like that with markdown. So I'm definitely going to point this at some book types code and blogs, of course, lots of blogs written in markdown. Anyway, so some of the cool features of this is that you can you can also turn it off for parts of it. So if you want to show an example of bad code, you probably don't want Ruff to reformat that for you. So there's ways to turn it off.
That's interesting. Don't do this, and it gets fixed. You're like, no.
Yeah. So there's some tricks around it though. So for turning it off, there's format off and on, and apparently there's there's something else that you could turn it off and on. But like if you're in the habit of just doing code blocks with just 3 ticks, it's not going to cut it because it's looking for what it's looking for those what are those identifiers? I don't know what you call that. The little thing after the 3 ticks to tell you what language.
Yeah, whatever the language designation is. Yeah.
Yes, but there's a few. They do py, Python 3, py3. If people are still using that.
It probably does that because it needs to know what language it is to decide how to format it.
Yeah, I mean it shouldn't try to format Rust as if it's Python, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. These semicolons are unnecessary. We took them away.
And the way Ruff works is through pulling it into the abstract syntax tree and outputting it again. So it has to actually be valid Python. If you have invalid Python that won't parse, it's not going to figure that out. It won't. I don't think it errors. It just doesn't do those. So if you anyway, and there's a preview mode that's kind of neat that you can say, hey, what would you do for this? But frankly, I would just have it in Git and let it go, and then you can do the diffs to see what it did. So cool thing there, and I'm pretty excited about that. One of the interesting bits is that it also does PYI files, so it will format. What are those type
stubs?
files?
Yeah.
Yeah. So Just a fun little tool. The caveat is this feature is only available in preview mode, and I didn't know what that meant, so I had to look it up. So preview mode means it doesn't mean you have to install anything different, but you have to enable preview mode by setting in one of your settings files. You have to say preview is true. So,
Oh, interesting. Like your Ruff toml or PyProject.toml or
yeah,
okay.
or you can pass -- preview in the command line apparently. So
Okay.
to get that,
Or you could download the source and recompile Ruff and then make that the default.
sure.
Just kidding.
Yeah.
Hey, there's 1,000 ways to skin the cat, as the goes.
Please don't skin my cat.
As morbid as that statement may be, there are many ways to do it.
It's terrible.
All right. So let's go to the cloud. To the cloud. Okay. So I want to talk about GitHub Actions. So here's the deal. I have some GitHub Actions. Maybe they format my markdown. Maybe they run my tests. Maybe they check against other things. Maybe they integrate with who knows what, right? There's a ton of GitHub Actions. So how do you do that? Well, maybe you create a feature branch and you commit, and then you wait for your project to not be busy and the GitHub runner to pick it up and run it. And then you pay your fee for the GitHub runner to run your thing while you're waiting, your computer's idle.
Yeah.
Right? You could use Jolt to see like that it's not doing anything. So there's this thing I found called Act. Nectos / Act. So Nectos is the person create. It's a little bit popular. 69,000 GitHub stores, 2,000 forks. So
wow.
If I hadn't heard of it, have you heard of this?
I think
maybe
rings a bell. But
okay. Well, maybe we even covered it like 10 years ago. Anyway, so the idea is you can run your GitHub Actions locally on your computer using nearly the same infrastructure. So you don't have to pay for them. You don't have to wait on them. You don't have to. One of the problems is you've got to make a commit. Like maybe you're not ready to commit. You're like, I actually want to see what the GitHub action result would be before I do commit it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah. So what you do is that this thing reads your GitHub workflow and your environment variables and all that based on what you have set there. And then it uses a local task runner. So basically sets up a Docker thing to run. Right. So if I scroll down here a little bit, it says reads those, then it uses the Docker API to pull the necessary image, defined in your workflow files. You can see the little thing running right down below. And then sets up the execution paths. Then it runs each container based on all the stuff that you have set in your action. Right. So it just basically runs here and off it goes. You could see like it gives you little like reports on how that went and so on. Did they pass and so on. So I think this is pretty cool.
Yeah, I think it's cool too. I wonder if there's something like this for GitLab. Cool. GitLab.
I wonder how similar the actions are. Like I've not set up GitHub Actions very much at GitHub and not at all on GitLab. And so maybe if they're basically file compatible, it's good enough. Because this doesn't actually use anything about GitHub either. It just says what are the Docker images and commands and stuff like that, basically. Yeah. So it may work.
Yeah. So this is definitely cool. Yeah, it is a kind of a pain to try to debug GitHub Actions to figure out what's going on. So yeah, I'll definitely check this out.
Awesome. So
nice.
What is the story on the extras? Do we have extras?
I have one, and I didn't before we started the show. But
I know I thought you had no extras, but now I'm hearing you have extras. What's the deal? There were none in the notes.
So I'll just do a quick one. So you brought up the book Lean TDD at the beginning of the one of the books. The one that's actually a book. So I had started, so Lean TDD, I just want to give a status update. Not much has happened. There's a lot happening, but it's all up here. So one of the reasons why I released it, so the first draft is done and it's out, and it's actually not really a first draft. It's probably second or third that's released, but I'm reading it now, and I definitely want to change the first couple chapters, and I know it's a dry subject, but if I'm having trouble reading it because it's a little dry, now I should be selling it more of like, no, it's super exciting. No, it needs to be more exciting than it is, because I am excited about the topic, but the initial start of it is a little rough to get started in the book. So I do want to like make it a little more exciting. And so there's been a lot of notes, but it's all been on paper. So I am still working on it. It doesn't look like that. If you've grabbed a copy, thank you. It's helped motivate me. I've had quite a few people grab copies, and things are moving. It just doesn't look like it from the outside. So anyway, and Mike the man says, you gonna write lean BDD? Well, the behavior-driven development and acceptance test-driven development are covered in the book. I kind of lump those together as well. And if you're Mike, if you're a BDD kind of person, I'd love to talk with you more about it. That's my extra. Is not much news.
Okay. Yeah. Very cool. Well, neat. I know how this goes. You're like, it's good. They're like, no, I got to do this again. I have this project. I rewrote it 3 times already. It's driving me crazy, but I think it's good now. It's finally the 3rd time. All right. Savannah Ostrowski says, stoked to share that the steering council has accepted PEP 814. What is PEP 814, you might ask? Well, that means winter is coming. Winter is coming. Why? Well, because PEP 814 is frozendict.
That was a bad joke.
No, it was so bad it was good, I think. No, anyway. The idea is that we've got frozen set, we've got other types of frozen item containers and data structures, but we didn't have frozen dictionary. So the idea is it's a read-only, right? So you create a thing, you want to be able to return it from a function or share it and have an absolute guarantee that people are not changing it, right? Adding or removing items, keys, and so on. I don't think that really applies to stuff referenced in there. So if you put a list as a value and then you go and like get the point of the list, you probably can still change it. But like, I guess it depends. If you fill it with only other frozen stuff, it's frozen all the way down. But it's really cool because it allows better concurrency. This is something we're going to be paying more attention to in the future as Python T starts, free-threaded Python starts to become a thing. You're like, well, I hate all this locking we have to do in these race conditions. Like, well, if you can't change it, you don't need to lock on it. You know what I mean? So that's very cool. I don't want to add any more than that, but it will be in Python 3.15. Yeah. Okay. The audience, Kiva Burb says that is excellent. We'll definitely be using this all the time for default params. Oh, you know what? That is a really interesting idea for default params. Yes. I hadn't really considered it there. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. And then a little bit of Django.
Also, please wear pants. I guess that's just, I don't know what that reference is, but.
I don't either. Okay. So Jeff Triplett posted on Mastodon in response to Paulo Melchiore saying, I just published the first article in a new series on my blog, Django ORM standalone. And Jeff and Mario and I were just talking about this like that same week. And like, would it be cool if you could use the Django ORM without Django, right? So maybe I've got a Django project, but I also have a little library I just want to run and also talk to the database. And I don't want to have a separate data access layer. I just want to have my models and a script, and I don't care about the web side of things. So basically that's Django standalone, right? Because any large project is going to start to have like different flavors and utilities and aspects, maybe daemons. And like, they don't all have to run the web app, They all shouldn't run the web app. So anyway, give it a little shout out to this article here.
Yeah, or even like if you want to do Fast API plus using the Django ORM.
Yeah, exactly. If you want to use the ORM on another web, like maybe you really love the Django ORM, but you also love Flask. Well, here you go. Let's do it.
That's exciting. Okay.
I talked about Command Book, this sort of long-running, this home for long-running terminal commands, like commands I want to run for 3 hours, like start up the web server and the daemon and the tail and just leave it. And if I accidentally close my terminal, I don't want them to go away. Or I don't want them cluttering up my terminal, right? Fun little app. There's a free version, free aspect, and paid aspect, personal license, and beyond. but I finally got around to writing up the motivation of like, why does this exist? Here's how it works. Here's why I created it, and so on. So I linked to the blog post. It says a 5-minute read according to my own website. So
you should do that plus like a little how-to guide and everything, and make a book out of it. Could be a command book.
a command book, or command book squared. I mean, let's go. How do we want to do this?
Yeah.
How do we want to do this? All right, I think we're ready for our joke. And this joke is called plug and paste instead of plug and play. Okay. Do people still talk about plug and play anymore? I don't know. It was like Windows 95 was such a thing. Yeah, that was like the big thing. Like now with plug and play, you can just plug in the USB thing. And anyway, sort of like that. So here's the joke. And let me set the stage. Like, you know how people say, oh, we only use 20% of our brain or 30% of our brain, and think how incredible humans could be if we could harness all of the power of the brain. And I'm not really sure I really buy into that. Like, do you really need to be using the running part of your brain and the part that controls thinking and the part that controls language? Like, that doesn't necessarily add capability. Anyway, so that's what it's based on. So there's this person sort of looking up like, whoa, what if we could use 100% of our brain? And then I think this is Morgan Freeman says, at work, a customer just tried to copy a document, unplug the mouse, and plug it back into another computer and paste it. Maybe we got a little more foundational stuff to work on than if we could use 100% of our brain.
Yeah.
What about 10%? Can we use 10%?
Yeah. You know that whole like 100% of your brain thing is not real. Like that.
I can totally see that.
That like people were saying like, oh, you on the average people only use like a small percentage of your brain. That's not true. We use all of it.
Yeah.
It's too costly to feed our brain if we weren't using all of it. But I mean, not everybody uses all of it.
I would say there's a range of engagement throughout
I think
society.
They're using it all. They're just like most of it's just doing reruns of The Simpsons. I think.
Well, that's probably true. I find that like when somebody, if the photons from TikTok hit a person's face, it's like a beam that shuts down about half of the brain. Like as the photons just strike the skin, it just.
I was listening to we're tangenting, yeah, but I was listening to a podcast and there was an ad for TikTok on the podcast advertising how safe it is for kids because of all the safety features they've got, and I'm like, that's insane.
It is insane.
So anyway,
yeah, that's a whole rant we can go on, but I think like TikTok and this short form stuff is like really hurting people's attention span and ability to engage for extended periods of time. Just watching my own kids.
Yeah. I'll have to find the article. I just found out that my wife found an article about how Gen Z is the first generation that's got a lower IQ than their parents.
Oh no.
But you know,
well,
on average,
I would say maybe the tests are just given wrong. Could they be given the IQ test? Could it be given as a TikTok series instead of, and then they might crush it. No, seriously, maybe. I think it might not be an intelligence. It might be a concentration thing.
It could be. Yeah.
I don't know, but it's not a great sign. Anyway.
Anyway.
I don't know. How do we get into this? I don't know. I thought that's the part 100% of your brain.
All right.
We're going to go use 100% of the brain to get this podcast ready and shipped to the world. Everyone, thanks for being here.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.